This might be a weird opening question because I really want to go back a little bit. I mean, a little bit, really, into your childhood, because you're the definition of a post-war child. You were born a month after the Second World War.
I think we were sort of somewhere between working class and middle class. So we there was no rubble where we were. There was a garden. So I spent a lot of time in those never-ending summers in my parents' garden, knocking balls against walls. Wanted to be a tennis player and running around and running off down the street on my bicycle to meet friends and stuff.
Were they a musical family?
My mother's brother had a sort of a ragtime band, and she used to play a little piano. Yeah, so kind of, yeah. My dad wasn't remotely musical.
Were they interested in music? Did they listen to music? And what sort of music did they listen to? Because your parents, I mean, I've got, you know, my mother's now passed, and she was a war generation, you know, she was in the land army.
Yeah.
And, you know, her musical tastes were formed in that era. So that was the sort of music that she listened to.
Well, I think my father liked opera, light opera, was very fond of Bing Crosby. And he thought he could kind of sing like him.
Could he?
Which, no, not really. Thinking back, he could hit a note, but the actual mechanics of playing music in those days were so different now. But luckily, my dad was, he ran a number of businesses in the centre of Manchester. He sold records, record players, tape recorders, TVs, cameras, and so on and so forth. So he had the latest version of whatever crap equipment was around those days.
Did that fascinate you back then?
Yeah, it kind of did, because it was a sort of magical cupboard with, you know, if you open the cupboard, there was a sort of magical turntable with knobs and things that you could turn. I never dared really mess with them till I was over, you know, probably about 14 years old, because I didn't know how to work them. But it wasn't a very musical family. I mean, as I recall, we didn't actually spend a lot of time listening to music, not really.
There's a definite drive for experimentation throughout your life, which is, for me, such a sort of fascinating thing, because you've never, ever seemed to have stood still in your life. And maybe when you have stood still, then you've gone for a change immediately. So I just wondered if you sort of analysed where your drive has come from.
Because my father, you know, like many fathers, was hopeful that I could go into the family business and become a businessman and manage the various shops that he had in town. And I used to, you know, to be honest, I used to go in on Saturdays to help out sometimes. And I gradually became fascinated with all the different facets of what he sold. You know, he had a music shop called Hyam's Harmony House, which I believe in the centre of Manchester. One of many music shops. But in the main shop, it was tape recorders, radios, record players, records and cameras. And just being behind the counter and actually, you know, taking people's cash and selling things, very badly, I should add, I sort of vaguely got to know what all these devices did. And of course, you know, in those early years, I was listening to things like Radio Luxembourg and stuff. And everything kind of gradually connected. And I got to sort of fiddle with things. I was pretty good at taking things apart, but pretty bad at putting them back together. You know, that syndrome. But I think really that this drive to keep changing and experiment came about after spending a number of years at art college. Me and Lol Creme, we were both 60s art college kids. And that's where that came from. At that time, there was a push to keep looking, keep searching. And we had a very interesting tutor whose sort of MO was different to all the others. He would run his fine art class in a very strange way. He would first of all find out what you were good at, and if you were right-handed and you were good at painting, he would make you paint left-handed, but using charcoal instead of a brush. In other words, which sounds really bizarre, but what it does, it takes you out of your comfort zone and makes you try things that you never really wanted to try because there was no need. But what he was trying to say was, if you try something different, if you keep looking for new ways to apply whatever talent you have, you may come up with something quite extraordinary that you may never have come up with if you'd done it the normal way. And occasionally one did, not all the time, but it was something that's kind of stuck with me. And I guess I've always sort of gone against a situation where there's a predictable outcome, if you like. If I'm writing a song and I can't write music to a brief, I find that very difficult. I sort of rail against that because I always like a situation where something is in flux until it becomes something that I didn't know that it would become. That's the excitement for me. It's not like walking across the road with your eyes closed. It's not quite like that, but it's a bit like that. There always has to be a little bit of jeopardy in there, a little bit of danger, because just going back to what Bill Clark said, the art tutor, there may be something extraordinary just beyond your grasp that you may be able to grasp if you go about it this way.
It's amazing. It sounds like, I mean, he installed in a way a philosophy into you, didn't he? It sounds like.
Yeah, very much so. Excuse me.
I mean, one thing about that type of idea is that not only is there nothing without risk, but failure is part of risk. So it also means that you have to open yourself up to failure. Is that something that during that period with Bill Clark, during that period at art college, that's where you allowed yourself to start failing in order to succeed?
Although the definition of failure in painting and art it's a fine line, if you know what I mean. You're really the only one who knows if you've done something interesting, I think. But he turned it into a game. It was kind of, he had people standing on one leg blindfolded doing stuff, you know. It was pretty crazy. But I think he did that because he wanted to make the experience fun and not something to be dreaded. Failure at art college, there's no such thing. You don't fail at art college. You just make messes or you do something amazing, you know. But I guess that depends on what you're studying. I've actually ended up studying graphic design, not fine arts. So,
was there a sense of that you were, as a teenager back then, part of something that was a real movement and something different, because it was a thing that was an alienation from your parents' generation?
I mean, it began earlier. It began towards the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s and it basically came from America. And that, of course, was Elvis Presley, an unprecedented situation where somebody was being banned for wiggling his hips on television. And I don't know, there were various youth movements going around at the time. I remember when I was very young, they were called Teddy Boys at the time, I think. And they used to stand on the street corners and threaten to beat you up as you went past. And that was their job, I think, back then. They looked amazing. But there was this other group of people, again from America, called the Beat Generation. And those of us who had any kind of artistic bent were kind of drawn to that particular tribe as opposed to the Teds, you know. And, you know, obviously we were pseudo beats back in those days. Like I'm wearing shades now, which I should explain. My office is in a conservatory, so it's incredibly bright. So I'm not being posy. But back then we were incredibly posy. We used to go to a coffee bar called the Kona Coffee Bar in Manchester and sit there doing this, you know, and writing poetry. And there was a candle in a Chianti bottle and all that. It was really, it was really pseudo stuff. But we identified with something, with a creative movement that turned out to be quite important in America and gradually spread. But the biggest influence probably that came, and I'm talking about myself and all my friends at that time, but mainly Lol Creme, was the Beatles. It sounds terribly corny and obvious now, but I've been thinking about it a lot. And what they somehow managed to do musically was capture the ferocity of the Teds, the physicality of the Teds, but wearing a look that was completely reminiscent of the Beat Generation. And they managed to combine both of the main tribes of that particular area, that particular era, sorry. And it was a very powerful thing. We weren't conscious of that at the time. And I think that is because they grew up creatively in Hamburg, not in England. Their influences were European as opposed to English more than anything else. You know, the way they looked, the instruments that they played were, you know, they weren't available in the UK at the time. And everything about them, they had their own names. They didn't have stage names. The way they performed, they sang and played at the same time. They didn't have a singer. It was quite revolutionary back then. And they made great tunes. And it became emblematic of that generation, musically anyway. I remember when the Sgt. Pepper album came out, and I showed up at college that day, and nobody was working. All the different departments, photography, printmaking, fine art, graphic design, photography, you name it, sculpture, they'd all stopped work, and everybody, students and tutors alike, were pouring over the album sleeve, and every department had a different track on. So it was like walking into Revolution #9 when you got to college. And it was such, it was a real door-kicking open moment.
How would you define what bound you to Lol Creme? Because obviously there was something there that I presume there was a friendship, which was one side of it, but there must have been some sort of interest in each other, the creative interest in each other that bound you together. Have you ever really sort of looked at that and sort of been able to define it?
In those very early years at art college, we were both trying to play things. I tried guitar. I was in a band, terrible, hopeless band called Group 17. I tried to play bass on a Hofner Club 50 6-string guitar, and I was crap. And I eventually sort of got into drums via my neighbour, who had a kit of drums and let me try it, and I was better than him. We wanted to be in bands, you know, like today kids want to be on YouTube or want to be this, want to be that. That was kind of the thing back then. And we both had aspirations in that direction, but we thought very much the same, slightly out of the box. We wanted to make musicals. We had ideas for weird stage shows, and we used to convene at the weekends and come up with sort of wacky ideas. So we were kind of on the same page at that very early stage creatively.
You mentioned the Beatles, and you mentioned that, you know, those type of bands in the 60s, which everyone tried to emulate. Did you initially try to emulate them, and when did the point come where you realized, okay, this isn't working for us, we should do something else?
It wasn't that clear cut. Yeah, of course we did. I think the first song we wrote was something called "The Best Seaside in the World," and actually I listened to it recently. It wasn't that bad, but it wasn't great. But yeah, we were, because the Beatles kind of defined that ilk and said, this is great music. And we were very young. It's like, okay, well, let's see if we can write something like that. And I think a lot of people did. But the point of realization that we weren't the Beatles and we could do something different came much, much later. We'd been in a band called Hot Legs briefly, myself and Lol and Eric Stewart. And we were still very much enamored with the Beatles style. The song that was a hit, well, it wasn't really a song, a thing that was a hit from that period was called Neanderthal Man, which came out of a sort of studio experiment and wasn't even a song, it was a thing. And that was a hit record. But the rest of the album was called Thinks School Stinks, I think at the time. There were a bunch of songs that were kind of like Beatles-ish songs meets Simon and Garfunkel songs. There was nothing individualistic about them particularly. That only came about at the very beginning of 10cc when we'd had a hit record. And we had to come up with an album very, very quickly, as you did in those days. And so we had like 3 weeks or something ridiculous to both write and record. So we booked ourselves into Strawberry and just got to work. And anything that we wrote, we recorded. And there wasn't time to sort of sit back and think subconsciously or consciously, oh, that's all right, but it doesn't sound Beatley enough. It doesn't sound like what good music is supposed to be. There was very little sense of self-critique, if you like, which was a great thing because we were working completely off intuition and instinct. And it was only sort of 2/3 of the way through the process, we realized that what we were making didn't sound like anybody else. It's like suddenly we began to notice that hang on, that's what the hell is this? So we thought, well, that's probably a good thing. So let's carry on along those lines. So it wasn't a conscious thing at all. And I think that's probably what happens to most people. Initially, they're trying to ape their heroes, which is a natural thing. But something happens, probably different ways of reaching the same point for everybody, that turns the basic capabilities into something that is very them. And that's kind of what happened. We became the result of these 4 people working together in a hurry.
How did that actually work? Because it's always, whenever I read or watch something about 10cc, there's always the talk of the 2 almost separate entities, you and Lol on one hand and the other 2 on the other, and that you're the experimental ones. What interests me is whenever I look at the track listings and I look at who wrote what and so on, it seems like 2, sometimes 3, but often 2 are credited and 2 are not credited, which seems a little bit odd when the contribution between the 4 is on the whole track. So maybe the first question is, how does that work? Who gets a credit on a record? How does that work? And secondly, what was the reality of working together and the contribution of each person?
Good question. Who got the credit? You mean under the title, on the single, etc.?
Yeah, exactly.
That's basically whoever wrote it. Whoever wrote the song. Normally what would happen is we would go off into as you quite rightly suggest, 2 groups, myself and Lol and Graham and Eric, and we'd write something and then we'd bring it in and offer it up. And 9 times out of 10, yeah, that's interesting. Let's record it. And it was more in, should we say, the production and arrangement side of turning a raw song into a piece of recorded material that everybody chipped in. And of course, it can change shape a little bit in that process, but they didn't actually change shape that much. All that happened was we found the best way of interpreting a song using all our collective talents. That's how it worked. It was interesting, and it worked the same pretty much for who performed it, who sang it. Everybody got a shot to sing the song, and if they weren't good enough, the rest of the band would hold a sign up saying next, and then Graham would go in and try it. If he wasn't good enough, Eric would try it, and it became obvious who should be singing the song. So it was very democratic, because the thing that led the process, which thinking back was an unusual process, was making a great record. That was it. That was all that really mattered. But we kind of went about it in a different way. Most people back then used to record a bunch of backing tracks for however many songs they'd written, and then gradually work on top of it, add a guitar to this one, guitar on that one, gradually move through the layers. We didn't do that. We worked on one track at a time. And if we had a sound in mind that worked, we put that sound in with echo as opposed to leaving the echo off. We'd make a decision, just going back to the Jeopardy thing. We like the echo stays. That will take us to somewhere else. So we were crafting it based on each layer of performance that we added to the track. So we were creating the finished sound of the track while we were making it, as opposed to leaving it to a mix. But it was very democratic. Everybody got a chance to do everything, pretty much.
I suppose what I'm getting at, I mean, you're saying it's democratic, and what I'm getting at is if you're credited on it, isn't there a sort of sense of ownership, and isn't there also a financial bonus by being credited as a writer, when, in fact, for me, the best 10cc records are the ones that have the unusual, different sound, and that may have come not as part of a credit on the track. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, some groups do that. I mean, U2 do that. Everybody gets the same in U2. But for whatever reason, we didn't. Maybe we were being possessive. I don't know. Everyone was. But I mean, don't forget that Graham was already a successful songwriter before 10cc came into existence. That was kind of the way it was done back then. You know, if you were the writer, you were the writer. And that's what everybody else got, mechanicals and PPL and all that kind of stuff. But you got the writing share, thank goodness, in later years. But no, it doesn't have to work that way. It's just how it worked.
There's also like a track like I'm Not in Love, and the initial song, I think it was Graham that came in with the initial song, am I right? The initial song wasn't really...
It was Eric and Graham wrote the song. I don't know who started the song, I've no idea. But they wrote the song, and I know what you're going to say, so I think I know what you're going to say. So we recorded it, but we recorded it in such a way that it didn't do the song justice, and it sounded a bit shit. We recorded it as a sort of cheesy bossa nova, and it didn't work, so we shelved it. We were in the early stages of, making the original soundtrack album. But we knew the song was good, but we'd just come up with the wrong treatment for it. So we shelved it and moved on with a view to coming back to it later, which we did. But yeah, I mean, it's a funny one. And just going back to your early comment with regard to I'm Not in Love, yes, I wish we did all share in that one, because my contribution was to come up with the idea of doing it all with voices. So that's okay. It all kind of balances out in the end. But as these situations often are, the idea of doing it all with voices was essentially, it was like out of desperation. And it was like, well, what's the most outlandish thing we can do with this? Excuse me, why don't we try it all in voices that never end? Pause, silence, a beat. So that's exactly what we did. But there was no guarantee that it was going to work. This kind of addresses the reason why the chemistry between the four of us worked so well. In a sense, Eric and Graham are a prime example of classic songwriters. Their aim has always been to come up with the great song. And that is the target. That is what they're trying to do. Whereas Lol and myself were much looser in that respect. Our job, in a sense, was to fuck it up. Our job was to say, no, but seriously, it's to stand on one leg with a blindfold and come up with something that you're not going to expect. And the two sides complemented each other very well, in that if something was too straight and too obvious, we'd add something that made it go in the other direction. And likewise, if we'd come up with something that was too wacky and too out there, they'd apply their talents to just twisting it back a little bit. And I think that's why the band was successful, because it was a combination of both those attitudes, really.
You had massive world fame thrust upon you, as it were, at a fairly young age, and it must have an effect.
Well, we weren't huge. No, we weren't huge, massive. I wouldn't say we were massive world fame thrust upon us. What I remember about fame is both Lol and myself went out and bought cars, as you do when you're about 25 or whatever it was we were. We bought two white, brand spanking new Lotus Plus 2S cars. And, driving them and crowding them. And I remember I pulled into a local garage, the one I used to go in with my old crap blue Hillman Imp, filled up with petrol, and promptly locked myself out of the car. My keys in. It's as if saying, just watch it, son. You're not as big as you think you are. And I was there for about half an hour waiting for someone to show up with this brand spanking new white Lotus Plus 2S with nowhere to hide. And it was a slight kick in the nuts to one's ego. And that's what I remember about fame, shall we say, or the early stirrings of fame. It was something that very quickly said, just don't believe it. It's still you. You've just got a flash card, but you lock yourself out, you dick. So, yeah, I hope it hasn't changed me a great deal. I think, let's call it success, let's not call it fame. I think as the band grew from that point, we had some hits quite early. We did quite well. We were never enormous in America, for instance. We toured there a few times. But the problem we had as a band, we were essentially a studio outfit. We sort of translated to the stage, but we were never that comfortable there. We didn't look the part, really, as a unit. Some of us looked okay, and some of us were comfortable, but it didn't gel as a live thing, other than the sound. And that was gradually becoming more and more important at the time. And we were becoming aware now, because we'd signed with a big label. We'd moved on from a small label. to a larger label, Phonogram. And there was a bit of pressure, you know, this music that you made is successful. So perhaps when you're making your next record, you should be thinking of doing a song like this, or maybe one of those, and a funny one, and a long Godley Creme one. You know, that kind of preemptive process was coming into the mix, and it was a bit uncomfortable for myself and Lol, particularly for me, because that element of jeopardy was gradually being eroded. It was like, I'm having to write to brief now. We need a funny one. Okay, let's go away and write a funny one. I'm not in a funny mood, you know. And of course, we had a road crew, and we had tours lined up, and there was, in other words, we had responsibilities, which crept up on us to a degree, and that became uncomfortable. You know, I don't want to sound like a spoiled brat, and I'm not moaning about it. It's just that what drove me, as you rightly said, was the need to keep changing and trying new stuff. That didn't quite fit the mold anymore. That wasn't the mold. That wasn't what we were doing. We created a successful beast. So our job was now to keep it successful.
I always thought about the music industry in terms of they were in that era particularly the gatekeepers, you know, the people in the record companies. But why would they know any better than the musicians making the music?
They, I imagine, analysed how and why some artists were successful and why some artists weren't quite so successful. But I think the one thing that made us stand apart from that syndrome was the fact that we weren't operating out of London, which was the main sort of centre of the music business, both in terms of talent, recording, and labels. We're up in the north of England in our own little studio, and therefore the label kind of felt that what we were doing okay already was successful, so they didn't come down to listen that often. So we were pretty much left to our own devices, because that was seen and actually was part of who we were. But that was gradually changing. Everything was changing, and as I said, there was a certain amount of pressure, and we were changing as people. You know, we were, you know, I got married. Lol got married. We began to understand the world a little bit more outside the studio environment. We were developing as people, and our tastes were changing. And I think that sort of impacted into what the group was coming, or what it could be, or what it couldn't be. And there was a point where it ceased to work, where, I don't know, Lol and I were hankering after doing something experimental. So we'd invented this musical instrument or device that plays the guitar in a different way, called a Gizmo. And we wanted to try it. So we booked 3 weeks in Strawberry Studios to give it a shot, to see what it was capable of. And we found that process was far more satisfying than what we'd recently been doing with 10cc. And this was just as we were about to go into pre-production for a new 10cc album. And okay, so we'd done that. We were buzzing about that, and we weren't sure what to do about it. And then we were due to go in to start recording a 10cc album, and we went down to the studio to hear a song that Eric and Graham had written to be included on the new album. And we didn't like it. We thought it was lame. So we said so. You know, it was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I mean, saying it now, it sounds like a bunch of spoiled kids. I don't like it, so I'm not going to do it. You know, and it probably was to a degree, but as you know, what drove us and what drove me was continuously moving forward and trying new stuff and not resting on your laurels.
Sounds to me like becoming an adult. Do you know what I mean? Being able to say what you want and what you don't want in a way. So maybe you can see that in a completely different way.
Yeah. Well, that's how it impacted on what we were doing at the time. It wasn't about. It ceased to become art. It was more about commerce, I think, at that point. And I didn't want that anymore. So, you know, the nuclear option happened, which was a shame. But I think it's, you know, I mean, looking past it now, I think it may be because partially we were from the north of England, where it was all one for all and all for one. We're all together, lads, you know, against the world. And that changed somewhat. I mean, other bands, contemporary bands like Roxy Music, who were friends of ours, they didn't do that. They had a much more sophisticated arrangement. If somebody wanted to do a solo project, they went ahead and do it. And the organisation accommodated that situation because they knew that they would learn something and bring that back to the table for the main event. You know, so but that couldn't work here for whatever reason. We were presented with the situation. No, you can't bugger off for 6 months and do your own thing. We've got a tour coming up, any record expected. You're either in or you're out.
It's always the threat where you can't go along with it if you're given that ultimatum.
Yeah. It wasn't that black and white, but that, right. You know, in a nutshell, that's really what it was.
In terms of video production, that also seems to have come about. I think accident is probably the wrong word here, but it's almost in the experimental way. You make An Englishman in New York, the video, and then suddenly you become video producers yourself. Strangely
enough, our first sort of run-in with pairing music with pictures was nothing to do with us, in a sense, other than that a small section, instrumental section of the Consequences album was used on a Benson and Hedges cinema commercial and used extremely well. So initially, we were providing music for pictures. How it happened was we were still with, I think we were with Polydor now, but, you know, obviously in a vastly smaller capacity than 10cc. I don't think we'd had a hit record as yet. And we'd written and recorded this song called An Englishman in New York. And we weren't a touring band. There was just myself and Lol Creme, and we had no intention of becoming a touring band. So we figured maybe the only way to do it is to make some kind of a film, short film. They weren't called videos in those days. They didn't really exist. The only time you get to see a piece of music film was usually either on Top of the Pops, where the band couldn't show up, or on the old Grey Whistle Test, for the same reason. So someone would make a weird little film to go with that piece of music. And we figured that was the only way to promote it. So we drawing on our previous artistic lives, college, and an innate desire to become filmmakers one day, we sort of cocked up an 8-frame storyboard and took it to the label, saying we want to make this film, you know, expecting to be kicked out the door. But they said, yeah, that's a good idea, but you have to work with a director because you've never done it before. Which, you know, obviously was, and, you know, we didn't know a video camera from a film camera really, but in those days. So we did. And we found the experience utterly thrilling. Of course, we were the artists, but it was our idea, and we had ideas of how the idea could be improved. You know, how we shot it, how he shot it, how it was to be edited, and so on and so forth. In other words, it brought something out of us that had probably lain dormant since our art college days to a great degree. And we took to it like ducks to water. It was a natural transition for us. And must have been a real pain in the arse because, we showed up at the edit and we were, what happens if you press this? Don't touch that. What happens if we touch that? Don't pull that lever. And the actual edited thing in the end, it's a bit of a mess looking back on it, but it does show that we weren't afraid to try things. And luckily enough, the director was, his name will come to me in a minute, was open enough to understand what was going on and allow us to try things, And as it happened, the finished thing and the song was a hit in Europe. It wasn't a hit in the UK, but it was a hit all over Europe.
Being artists help you actually work with artists when you were making videos for, all these great artists during that era?
I think that is one of the reasons why we were successful in the media, because at the time, at the very beginning of the music video years, there weren't that many people directing videos, particularly in the UK. And some had come from commercials, some from television, some from documentaries. But I think we were the only duo directing that came from music. And I think that made musicians much more comfortable to talk to people who could understand, A, what they were trying to say, and B, how they'd like to be portrayed. And so there was a point of contact. And I think that was incredibly helpful, yes, very much so.
You've talked about being experimental in 10cc musically, experimental in your music with Lol, experimental in making videos. Where do you think, or what video that you've made for someone else has been actually made better by you going into an edit suite? This is a generalization because maybe it's in some other way. You going into an edit suite and you mucking about, and actually that video suddenly took on a new life because of what you added to it. And what did you add to it?
Two come to mind immediately. The first one, I think, was Rockit for Herbie Hancock. It was a strange brief because MTV at the time apparently weren't playing many black artists. So the brief was, come up with an idea with Herbie in it that's not overt. And it's like, what? Okay, let's see if we can break this rule. And I remember seeing a short piece on a local news program in Manchester about this artist called Jim Whiting, and it showed a little bit of his work. So I sort of dived for the VCR machine, such as it was back in those days, frantically pressing buttons, and managed to tape about 5 minutes of this piece. And I think it was the week before the track had landed on our desk as a possible job, but we hadn't thought of anything yet. And when I saw Jim's work, it was like, that looks like that sounds. And Lol agreed. So we ran up an idea of how we could possibly make this happen. We met with Jim and he made a few more creatures, and we went into a studio and shot the shit out of it, basically. Not even to the music, because it was very noisy hydraulic machinery that made them work. So we just filmed them in sort of stylized domestic settings against a black background. We hadn't a clue how it was going to slot together, but we knew in our bones that this stuff would work. And when we hit the edit, we started editing it together, but we decided, difficult though it was, that one of the dominant sounds on the track was scratching. But that's not really possible to do on video, particularly back then. What you really needed to do was cut between the footage going forward and the different versions of the footage going backwards. So we transferred all the footage running backwards as well as forwards. And we spent hours cutting frame by frame between them. And we must have been there for like 20 hours or something, because, you know, we had the stamina in those days. And we finished it, and we looked at it, and we thought, fuck, they're going to kill us. Because, no, seriously, because in those days, there was no such thing as a video commissioner. There was no such thing as you having to present a treatment to the management band or label. How it worked was, if they'd seen something that you'd done that they liked, they trusted you. They said, we want a film to go with this piece of music. Can you come up with something? And you said, yes. That's how it worked. You have this amount of money. Can you make it work for that? Yes. And we did. It was as simple as that. It was all about trust. And then obviously it changed. But back then, that's what happened. So we presented this thing that we'd done to the powers that be, and there was a few days of silence. we were gritting our teeth and biting our fingernails. Nobody really knew what it was. Herbie apparently didn't understand it at all. But we felt that, I don't know, just instinctively we felt something was coming. MTV was only just beginning around about this time, I think. It hadn't been around for long, and it was only in America. And we just felt that, you know, live or die, this would give MTV a kick in the balls. Whether they'd show it or not is a different thing. But they did, and it was on high rotation for a long, long time and made the record a hit, you know. So it reinforced that attitude in us, that whatever it was that we could bring to the party, however different and strange, is something that is going to work in this new medium. And it didn't do our reputations any harm either. And we won, I think, 5 MTV astronauts for it, the first MTV Awards.
What was amazing about, I remember seeing that when, you know, in the early 80s, and seeing that on TV, probably on Top of the Pops, and actually being completely blown away by it because it was something so different. It also gave Herbie Hancock a mainstream hit, which, you know, had eluded him. You know, this showed really the power of video. But one thing that I think you've always done, which I found fascinating, is almost you've led technology. Do you know what I mean? You've made something by, let's say, pasting it together, and then the technology comes along and can make it later. Do you know what I mean? Almost like Cry. Cry was, you know, this incredible video, and it looks like something that a computer did, but it's not, is it?
No, that was the other example.
Oh, tell me.
I was going to give. Well, the original idea for Cry, because Lol and I, we weren't particularly comfortable about making videos for ourselves. It was like, okay, these 2 cranky old artists have written a great song and recorded it. Who should we get to film it? Has to be us. Unfortunately, the artists were us as well. So it's a difficult one. So we had to come up with something that was simple and that would allow us to perform the song without going through mad gyrations or anything too ridiculous, because the budget was going to be limited. So our original idea was not to be in it at all. It was to have Torvill and Dean skate to the song and film that. Unfortunately, they wanted to do it, but our diaries didn't match. They couldn't do it when it was needed to be done. So the thing that ended up as the final video was Plan B. It was, oh shit, what can we do? Oh, we'll just film our faces. And because it's the kind of song that anyone could sing, let's get loads of different people singing it as well. And we'll kind of line them up in the camera, and we'll think of something to do in edit. I should, maybe now's a good time to suggest that our approach to making these films was very much like our approach to making music. You know, we try stuff, and if that chord didn't work, we try a different chord. Or if that word worked better over here, if that phrase worked better over here, we try it. It was essentially making both became trial and error to a great degree. Obviously, the further you spend in the medium, the longer you spend in the medium, the more it seeps into your consciousness, and you know what to avoid and what to go for. But that way of thinking has always been there. So we kind of figured if we shot this stuff, there would be something interesting that we could do whilst editing to turn it into an interesting film. And initially, we just dissolved between the faces. If you actually look at the video, I think the first 3 or 4 facial mixes are just the whole face mixing to the next whole face, mixing to the next whole face. It's only from about 4 in the faces began to, and I use the word loosely, morph from one face to another. And that was because we thought, that looks a bit shit. Why don't we try a wipe? Now, a wipe is a very simple editing tool which can open from the middle as a circle, revealing whatever picture is underneath, or wipe from the top to the bottom, the top down, or this way or that way. But you can also have it with a soft edge, so you can't actually see the old one going and the new one coming. So we tried that, and it was like, bang, shit. When you go from face A to face B, there is a new face, there is a new person in between face A and face B. And that was unbelievable. And we just carried on using that technique throughout the rest of the film. Again, it was a long edit. But yeah, it worked incredibly well. And it was incredibly simple, because the human face inherently is attractive and interesting. It does hold your attention. And
but they were carefully chosen.
Again, it was different to
the other people.
Not carefully, but yeah, they were chosen because they had interesting faces. We essentially picked them out of a casting book. And we sent every one of them a cassette of the song to learn prior to the shoot. Not everybody did particularly well, so we had to use them where they're not miming. But it actually really seemed to work better with this face for this point than the another face for this point. So again, there are some sessions that you do that are somehow blessed or magical. The series of sessions, jumping way back, that we did for I'm Not in Love were magical. Everything that we tried on the finished recording worked incredibly well. Everything that we added worked incredibly well. And it was the same with Crime. Every face that we tried worked incredibly well. So we were left with this thing at the end, and we were, what the hell is this? They're not going to kill us for this one, but will it help the song do well? And again, the answer was yes. And it reaffirmed that if you come up with something that is good and it is different to everything else that's going on, you do stand a chance of being noticed in a good way. It just reaffirmed that thing that had always been there from all those years ago, from Bill Clark.
Many artists that I've talked to who have a long history and who have a success in the past are often very rooted in the past. But this is something, I mean, it's not long ago you did your first solo album. You are still rooted in experimentalism. When we met at the Reeperbahn Festival a few years ago, you had this app which was also an experimental app. And there's been a massive development in your life. And although you have your successes, you are still like active and in the present, which is very unusual, I think, in the music business. It's not that many people who have had a long career who still have that. So what do you strive for today? What did you strive with Muscle Memory? What do you look for today?
Again, it's an intuitive thing. The whole Muscle Memory project was experimental in that I ended up working with people who I'd never met. I don't know if you know anything about the history of it, but because my only musical instrument, the only instrument I could play is drums, which isn't the best instrument to write songs with. So once I decided to make a record, I had to find people I could write with. So I put an ask out there on Pledge Music, asking people to send me pieces of instrumental music that they thought I may be able to turn into songs. I thought I might get 40, 50. I got 286 pieces of music, which is nuts. But marvelous. I didn't expect that at all. So I had to, the idea being was I get a mix from each of them, a rough mix, put it in GarageBand and start singing over the top, which is a sort of technical way of doing what we used to do, sitting opposite somebody while they strummed and I sang, but I no longer have to make them coffee, which was kind of better. And it worked incredibly well. There was a precedent a few years earlier. A couple of people, again, who I didn't know, had sent me pieces of music for that very reason and asked me to write a song over each of them. And both turned out very well, ended up on the album, as a matter of fact. But I found it exciting that the discipline of having something that not only was written, but was recorded. And that really worked well for me. I could sit at home and just try things, however outlandish, until I had something that I liked. And all I really did was go through the 286 pieces of music and whittle them down until I had 12 tracks that I felt I could work with. And then I tried things and found that I could and finished each one. But it was the beginning of the project. I wasn't consciously looking for any particular style of music. I was hoping to tap into the wellspring of talent that was out there. People, recording on laptops in their bedrooms and garages and on buses or whatever. But again, it was the element of the unexpected that attracted me. I like this. That was really interesting. Can I come up with anything that would work for this? I didn't want to play safe. I didn't want to come up with, sort of something that lasts 3.5 minutes on an acoustic guitar and it's lovely. Make some fucking noise and send it to me. It's the challenge, always the challenge that is exciting. And I actually didn't know that it would work as a cohesive album till we started to put the track listing together. And it did, strangely enough. And I was very pleased with the result. It is quite a contemporary sounding album because most of the people who I work with were way younger than me. And I've only ever met one of them.
That's amazing.
Still.
Listen, Kevin, I just want to say finally, thank you for the interview. But more than that, I want to thank your art teacher because I think he installed something in you which has actually given all of us some amazing pleasure over the years. So thank you again.
That's very kind. His name is Bill Clark.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kevin.
My pleasure.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.